All right, so the onset of this wave, and I do admit, yes, it is really truly a revolution. I do believe it is a revolution in the true sense of the term. There is a really interested in that there's a social revolution that takes place. Well, in the United States, it's not a sudden social revolution. It really is a cultural and political revolution that takes place. To another, and this is a social revolution as well as a political one. This is Smart, who is a novelist who lives in Maryland but has written a trilogy on the Haitian Revolution. The first one, called All Souls Rising. When I go to movies and right. I have to admit that I got reading here. This is too brutal. It is an incredibly beautiful. You want to, Madison Sparrow wrote a biography of one of the key figures we're going to see here, Toussaint Louverture. Although I have to, when I use a biography, it's so boring. Like, I loved his novel, right? It's like, but the biography's kind of plodding. Students version read how Saint-Domingue, Haiti comes into existence, place in the rebellion. We'll look about a little bit about the aftermath of that. Whenever I have lectured about Haiti, even when I have multiple lectures to this topic, this is one you need a player program to tell all the players. So you simplify and go, okay, well, it's back and forth and this and that and these guys. So convoluted, chaotic situation, right, where there are multiple colonial powers, people controlling parts of the island, going back and forth in civil war. So if you actually establish a timeline and sort of said who's where, when, and who controls what, the time is long and detailed. So very simplified. Okay, so what today Haiti, the western of the island of Hispaniola. It's one of the first islands. As Columbus comes into the Caribbean in 14 names these. The big island becomes the island, La Española, which in Hispaniola, but today the eastern two-thirds is the Dominican Republic, and the third is what today is Haiti. Okay? And as you can see, it's centrally located in the Caribbean basin. Once again, from the point of view of the empire, the Caribbean is the access to the empire. Those shipping lanes in and out are the gateway to the empire. So this is why places like Cuba become so important in the colonial period. It's not because of still see this. If you go to Havana or Old San Juan or Cartagena, you can still see these colonial fortifications where the access points into the empire. So this is a really important location. Although even the old 93. Once the Spanish move into Cuba becomes more important, Havana becomes the principal port, and so the island of Hispaniola becomes secondary in terms of the to happen in the 17th century. I talked a little bit about these are really global struggle empire playing in the Americas. And in the case of the Caribbean, points. So when the English finally get their act together, or start to, when the French finally, when the Dutch emerge, they will attack the Spanish Empire on all these islands. Which, you look at the Caribbean today with the English-speaking islands, the Dutch-speaking islands, the carving out pieces as staging grounds. They're by Mexico, right? Strong enough to occupy some of these small islands to use them as staging grounds. All right? Johnny Depp, if they're pirates. If they're on your side, they're privateers. Right? It changes from just like, freedom. Well, colonial empire you belong to. And so what will happen in the 17th century is French pirates will start to use this western part of the island as a staging ground. The Spanish presence is really on the eastern end. So sort of chunks of territory. This is where you get bucket pirates, and eventually you get enough French and enough French interest that they have little is from the by the 18th century. Eventually, the Spanish will recognize. So what you have, often referred to Domingo, that's my East Texas French, San Domingo. This place on this island, in fact, it takes place across the western one-third, is really a fundamental, radical, violent, relatively rapid transformation by anybody's social science. This is a revolution. Right? You move from a French colony to an independent nation. The white slave owners, who are a very small minority, are overthrown, expelled, and largest, really the only success in the Americas. Right? There are lots of, here's a little bit of the Brazilianist point of view. Prices in the Caribbean and Brazil all the time, throughout the entire period of slavery. What is stunning to me when you look at the United States is how rare they are. All those famous slave rebellions, you can count them on one hand. It's like, and usually they're still, okay, Denmark Vesey and Stono, and it's like, oh, whoa. Because these rebellions are taking place all the time, and this is the most dramatic and most successful example. This is the ultimate nightmare of those planter elites. Those guys in Virginia, this is what they wake up in the middle of the night about, right? Especially after 1791. The revolution, I do believe, is this radical political revolution. In the case of Haiti, it is a dramatic social revolution. Time you get to the end of the century, the French have started more permanently. Here it is, the Brazilian. They were Brazilian pattern, right? After about 1570, accelerating after 1600, the Portuguese will create in Brazil the first plantation colonies. They bring in cane sugar that they've been raising on the islands of the Atlantic for 100 years. It's a very high-priced and expensive commodity. The Indians won't work for them. They resist. They flee. They die. So they say, well, let's try bringing Saharan African slaves. So from about 1570 to 1600 is when you see for the first time in the Americas the emergence of slavery from sub-Saharan Africa producing cash crops. The Portuguese make sugar a common item on your table in Europe. So all the dentists in the world can say thank you to the Portuguese. Right? I don't know, what were they doing before this? Running around with honeycombs, I guess. So sugar becomes this powerful commodity in the 17th century. The Dutch will come into Brazil in the 17th century, occupy the Northeast, learn how to do this. Second half of the 17th century, the Dutch, then the French, then the English will reproduce this pattern in the Caribbean. Sugar and slavery. Sometimes it's tobacco, and eventually South. So this pattern begins. So what is Saint-Domingue is reproducing this pattern in the Caribbean in the late 17th and early 18th century. Richest colony in the world. The French, the estimates are 1/3 of all of its foreign trade is coming out of Haiti. Right? Hundreds and thousands of tons of sugar, tobacco, in particular, Atlantic. But it is an incredibly imbalanced racial hierarchy. The usual estimate is there are about 400,000 slaves in this tiny little place, right? About 20,000 are what are called people of color. They're racially mixed. They're mulattoes. And about 25,000 are whites, right? Who, in a fashion similar to what we'll see in Spanish America, you have the guys who really see themselves as French. They just showed up from Paris, right? Or who knows, Bordeaux. Right? And then the guys who are French, but they were born on the wrong side of the Atlantic, right? So you have this sort of, there's a distinction, cultural, social distinction within the white population. They then look down on the population, who then look down on 400,000 slaves. What's striking about these 400,000 slaves is probably half of them in 1791 are slaves who were born in Africa. That means they have arrived into the island of Hispaniola, right, recently. And that's an enormous population of people who have not grown up in slavery. They have not been acculturated into local language and customs, that they have gotten off the boat, right, and some of them quite literally recently. Most of the slaves who come into Haiti, it appears, come from Angola and the Congo. Right? Angola is the great slave trading, exporting region of the entire slave trading period. Right? Most of the slaves that come across the Americas come out of sort of the area from roughly what is Ghana to about Angola. Right? And in the case of Haiti, most of these are coming out of Angola and the Congo. Now, having said that, Congo and Angola are modern terms for these places. What you have is really dozens and dozens of people speaking different African languages, coming from different cultural traditions, different political entities. So there's long debates in the people who study slavery, what I call, to take something from my old paleontology, anthro-underground, the lumpers and the splitters. Right? You get the people who say, oh, they may have come from all these different places, but there's enough sort of linguistic and cultural similarities. In fact, you really have these clumps of maybe half a dozen major groups. And then the splitters who say, oh no, this is all like, you know, they can't talk to each other and they're all divided and there's no sense of. So there's a huge debate that continues in slavery to what extent people who are coming out of a similar region of Africa actually see themselves part of the same group, right, in terms of solidarity. What this also means is that Haiti, along with the Caribbean, much of the Caribbean, and the eastern coast of Brazil, are the most Africanized places in the Americas. As much as we talk about African Americans, even on this campus, most university campuses, what they mean is people of African descent in the United States. They rarely realize that someone will concede this, but you look at what they teach in classes, here's my criticism. The largest populations of people of African descent in the Americas are not in the U.S., right? So when you're talking about African America, it really is millions of people spread across Brazil, the Caribbean, and to a lesser extent, what's the U.S. South. This is a huge flow of people. At the moment that the revolution breaks out, the estimates are in the previous decade or so, about 30,000 slaves are entering the colony per year. What that means is you have lots and lots of people in 1791 who've arrived within, say, the last decade. You have a very large population of people who have not at all adjusted, shall we say, to conditions of bondage. And so the argument is that these are people who are more likely to fight back and revolt as opposed to somebody who's third or fourth generation slave family. What emerges out of this is what you see in lots of places in the world. The dominant language is transformed by the people who are non-native speakers. So the way people speak in the British West Indies, right? They also, besides that, have their own sort of language that they speak among themselves. It has its own structure and grammar, which is incomprehensible to those of us who speak English. Right? The same thing happens in Haiti. What you eventually get is this language that becomes known as Creole. So when they speak it, when you're in the Miami airport, for example, and look at the signs, right? It looks sort of familiar, but there's something sort of odd about it, right? And this is because it's a combination of sort of African languages and grammars and vocabulary with French, and so it eventually becomes its own language. So what is emerging already in the 18th century is a separate language which is spoken, right? And in particular what emerges is what's called Vodou, Voodoo, Vodun, you get various spellings of this, which is taking sort of influences from them in the Americas. Okay? The equivalent of this in the United States is how you see how mild the African influence is here. We go, oh, call and response. Yeah, okay, but they're not speaking another language. It's Christianity with a little bit of different versions. The symbols and biblical thing for African Americans become, oh, the River Jordan. What does that really mean? Moses, right? In these truly African American religions, what you see is gods, spirits, deities from Africa who gradually take on new meaning in the Americas. In most of these religions, Santeria in the Caribbean, Candomblé or Macumba in Brazil, Vodun, typically what this is a belief that the world is inhabited by powers or spirits, and you appeal to these, you invoke them, right? It's not black magic, right? It's recognized the universe has all these forces, and you appeal to different, so there are hundreds of these deities in Africa. Half the Americas is maybe a couple of dozen of them survive, often in different forms. So that St. Barbara in northeastern Brazil is known as Iansang, associated with storms and thunder and lightning, right? St. George, right, is identified with the god of the hunt, right? Virgin Mary, Jesus are identified with these deities. But as you go from one region to the next, the kind of identifications vary. So they look very similar on the surface, but the particular structure in each place is slightly different. So Vodou is very similar to this. You invoke these powers, the spirits. So typically you have some sort of ceremony, usually with music, movement. People go into speaking tongues, trances. The spirits speak through them. And after this act of possession, you then share a ritual meal. Okay? So what emerges is truly new religions. Right? These are religions that don't exist in this form in Africa, and they're not indigenous to the Americas. In this sense, they truly are African-American religions. This is emerging in most societies until the mid-20th century. These religions are suppressed actively by the governments. Okay? Today, they're sort of glorified as this is who we are, this is our tradition. So if you go to northeastern Brazil, it's like, oh, come take the tour of the Candomblé ceremony, right? Oh, here it is, Macumba for tourists. Right? It's now sort of, oh, this is our official. But in the 18th century, this is seen as being traitors, seditious, subverting the established order, so it usually has to take place dark in the night, obscured, it's subterranean. Okay? So what you tend to see then is this emergence of a culture among the slaves that includes new language, new forms of religion, and they have to lead at least dual lives, right? On the surface, you have to appear to adhere to all the things you're supposed to, especially if you're a slave in a house, right? You interact with people, but you never really know if your slave is going off and practicing voodoo night and in a slave insurrection. So when you look at, whoever made this map didn't know how to spell Spanish, did they? When you look at this map, the northern plain of Haiti, that northern finger sticking out, is really where the revolt begins. This densely populated, heavily agricultural region. Port-au-Prince down here is on the edge of the bay, but the northern plain where the revolt's first going to arrive. And this is where you really see transatlantic connections. It's a French colony, right? 1789, you get French Revolution, they killed the king, right? They establish a republic, they issue the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, and these mulattoes and some of the whites in San Domingo, yeah, that's a good idea. So this collapse of the old regime of monarchy, aristocracy, hierarchy, and suddenly liberty, fraternity, and equality, right? A lot of those free blacks are going, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And they take seriously the phrase, men are born free and equal in rights. Right? Interpretation. The slave rebellion does not start this revolt. It's actually those people who are in the middle. Right? Those people of mixed race who are privileged not to be in that 400,000, but are below the 20 or 25,000 who run things. Vincent Auger, whose picture is over here, is a mulatto. So to really oversimplify all the twists and turns here, what you get is an uprising by the mulattoes that say, we're taking seriously the French Revolution, we're taking seriously the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, we want to have these rights too. Not the slaves. Right? We want to be like these white people who are free. Okay? You should treat us the way all these privileged whites are. We should all be part of a process in selecting representation, doing exactly what they're doing back in France. So Auger leads a revolt to take power, and this is brutally suppressed. The punishment for those who are the leaders is to place them on a wheel in the middle of the main plaza in Port-au-Prince, and over the course of about 24 hours, break each bone in their body so that they will die painfully and slowly as an example to anyone else who would contemplate rising up. Right? So it's a very bloody, it's sort of, we don't want this happening again, this is what happens. The slaves who are less important, they just kill them. Hang them in the streets, usually it's in strategic locations, say, this is what happens when you rise up. Okay? Learn this. There's this great quote by one of these, we took up the intoxicating cup of novelty without realizing it contained poison that would tear up our intestines. So those guys who are whites and some of the mulattoes who take seriously this Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen are unleashing forces they will have no control over and will devour most of them. So you get this, the upheaval of this mulatto revolt, and after a couple of years, you know, those slaves are out there going, you know, the people who are powerful are divided among themselves, weak, this is the opportunity. So it's really not until August of 1791 that you date the beginning of the slave rebellion in Haiti. There is a voodoo priest by the name of Boukman, who is usually credited as being the guy who circles around him a few key leaders to organize the initial phase of this rebellion. There are all these debates, which will no doubt never be answered because there's no documentation, over whether some of these key figures, in particular, in a second, are in on this initial conspiracy. But what happens is tens of thousands of slaves do rise up at this moment and attempt to overthrow the white planters. At this point, the mulattoes go, oh, wait! And they understand that their interests are on the side of the whites and not the slaves. So you get this interesting sort of resistance by the 40,000 or so mulattoes and whites to suppress this slave rebellion. And this is where you see the incredibly complicated imperial politics here. The Spanish, the British, and the French all are engaged in this, right? They all have interest, right? What happens if this spills over in Jamaica where there's another 300,000 slaves? Right? What happens if this moves into the southeast of the United States? What happens? The French are sitting there, what about the other islands, right? But remember, this is so the French organize their army and they're going to sweep across all of Europe, right? So the Spanish are going, French, they're bad. The English are saying, how do we play into this? So initially what you see is the Spanish actually come to the aid of the slaves who are in uprising because they want to see the French thrown out. Right? England comes in on the side of the French planters who are monarchists, right? The sides will change here multiple times over the next decade. The French National Convention, right? It's sort of saying, oh yeah, liberty, equality, fraternity. In 1793 and 1794, they go, yes, we're behind abolition. We believe slavery should be abolished. Get rid of it. So within France, not only is the political climate constantly shifting depending on who's in power, the message then coming across to whoever's trying to run things in Saint-Domingue keeps shifting. So this is an incredibly chaotic situation. I imagine if you were a French planter or a royal official sitting there in Haiti, in Saint-Domingue, you're constantly trying to figure out, okay, now if I do this, what's the situation in fact going to be tomorrow back in Paris? The freed slaves actually rise up and join the colonial elite at one point to throw the British. Right? So this goes back, that's why I said this, if you actually sort of went through month by month, year by year, people are changing sides constantly. This is going to be true, as we'll see here in a second, of those who are leading the revolt. They're constantly switching sides as well. But the great figure, the sort of iconic figure who emerged out of the Haitian Revolution is Toussaint Louverture. He is one of those slaves, right, who his family had been in Saint-Domingue for a while. Right, so it was his grandfather who came from Africa. He is somebody obviously is incredibly smart and talented. The planter that raises that family recognizes this, and he gets education on the plantation to be cultivated as one of the key supervisors. So he does speak French, although apparently not well. He's a speaker of Creole. He is freed by his master in 1777. He marries. He has 2 sons. Right? He is also trained in sort of what we would sort of think of as sort of veterinary medicine, I guess. He works with horses and animals, and so he sort of knows. So he has sort of medical. How he's thinking about it? Okay, what's your experience? Working with bleeding. Oh, I've worked with horses. Very reassuring. He is Catholic, although there are long debates of whether secretly he is a practitioner of Vodun. He clearly is completely Frenchified, that he looks up to France. He also is a vegetarian. Kind of odd. And his last name is not Louverture. This is a name he chose, which all sorts of interpretations, but supposedly the one who opened the way. All right. But Toussaint becomes the great and tragic figure of the Haitian revolt. But to show you how complicated, what he unleashes within this community of people are race wars, multiple race wars, right? This sort of, all people who are white will band together. Oh, all people of color will band together. No, none of that works. Toussaint initially joined the French side, but allied with the National Convention. Right? So he's saying, oh yeah, French Revolution, I believe in that. He's not interested in independence for Saint-Domingue. Right? He's one of these what are called caudillos in Spanish America. Strong man, leads by force of personality, brilliance in negotiations and working with people on the battlefield, ruthless. So he emerges out of the ranks as one of the great figures who's leading his own army. He works with the British. He works with the British to negotiate their withdrawal eventually. So he emerges in the mid-1790s as one of these key figures, but these guys who are major leaders of their own armies. And what you see is they're constantly not only fighting to throw out the French or the British or the Spanish, but they're fighting among themselves for control and supremacy. Here's just one version of it, one piece of this. André Rigaud, who is a mulatto, hates whites bitterly. He puts together his army of mulattoes and at each other. Right? It's an incredibly brutal and ruthless conflict, no prisoners. At this point, the U.S. is going, which side should we be on? And they look at Rigaud and go, let's help you. back and forth to put him in position against Rigaud. So at this particular moment, the U.S. is going, we're backing this guy because we don't like what's happening here. Eventually, Rigaud loses, flees to France. And they then have a bloodbath. The instructions Toussaint gives to his lieutenant is, see you bathe the island in the blood of the mulattoes. So the race wars that take place in Haiti are not simply black against white, right? People of color against people of color. This is an astonishingly violent upheaval. But Toussaint's this sort of tragic figure. He eventually will emerge as the dominant figure on the island. He does not want independence. He stays loyal to his idea of France. In 1801, they will move across the eastern two-thirds of the island so that they occupy all of Hispaniola. There are these huge debates in the Dominican Republic today of how do you describe what happens in the Dominican Republic in the early 19th century? Because between 1822 and 1844, all of the island is under Haitian control. And believe me, there is no love lost between the Haitians and the Dominicans. Right? Think of how the negative images of, say, Mexicans in the United States, multiply that by many factors, and that's the way Mexicans look at Haitians. Right? There's a long history of this. And part of it goes back to these struggles in independence. Toussaint will also say that the way the island can provide for itself economically is we have for many of these former slaves, they're going, wait a minute, we got our freedom, but now we got to go back and work in the plantations. He actually brings some of the white planters back in and says, look, if you cooperate with the regime, this is how it's going to work. So those who do not like Toussaint will go, see, this guy wasn't about liberty, fraternity, equality. He's just about running things. He's just a dictator. Then Napoleon comes to power in France, right? And eventually Napoleon decides he's going to reinstitute slavery. So in 1802, he sends his brother-in-law, Leclerc, again, that's my East Texas French, sends him to the islands with a huge amount of troops to reoccupy the island. So what goes on is intense battles and negotiations. In fact, most of the French troops will die from yellow fever. Leclerc himself dies from yellow fever. Right? The great enemy of most foreign troops in Haiti is disease, especially yellow fever. Eventually, they will persuade Toussaint, with the collaboration of a couple of his key lieutenants, that they're willing to negotiate a deal. Toussaint will send his two sons off to France in the custody of French officials to be educated. When he appears to face-to-face parley and negotiate, they tell him, you're now our prisoner. Right. And so what will happen is he will be shipped back to Europe. His lieutenants now say, our competitor's out of the way. Right. The French are happy. They got rid of this guy. They think this is it. And he will die in prison in Jena in April of 1803. Same prison that Joan of Arc was in at one point. So he dies this sort of tragic figure. Here is this great figure who's the liberator, but he does not finish the struggle. He's tricked and imprisoned by his associates, and he dies in prison. So what then happens is what you often see in major revolutionary upheavals. Here's another parallel. Mexican Revolution. Mexican Revolution breaks out in 1910. By 1914, the old regime is gone. And then what you get for the next 6 years is fighting to see who will, is it going to be Pancho Villa, is it going to be Emiliano Zapata, is it going to be Obregón, and eventually, among all those victorious rebels, somebody emerges as the most powerful figure. So this is what then takes place after the departure of Toussaint. The two key figures are Dessalines, who betrayed Toussaint and then vie for power. Dessalines, who's actually born in Africa. Right? So he's one of those recent arrivals. He's been changing sides back and forth along with the other allies, but it's actually Dessalines who on January 1st, 1804 announces the creation of the independent nation of Haiti, which comes from an indigenous word that supposedly means land of high mountains. So it's interesting, here you have these people of African descent who've achieved their independence and then choose to name the island after an indigenous word. Right? But so Saint-Domingue ceases to exist in 1804, and it becomes the independent Republic of Haiti. But then Dessalines decides he wants to be a monarch. Oh, Jacques I, okay. And the fighting is not really over because now the question is, okay, now that all these other European powers are gone, who will then control the island? And so he's assassinated in October 1806 and replaced largely by Henri Christophe, who most likely was born in a British island in Grenada, right? And probably was never a slave, right? It's possible a number of these key people fought in the American Revolution. Here's connections. One of the guys I've left out here, my colleague, be upset. There's one of the key figures at the very beginning of this revolt, is a guy named by the name of Georges Biassou. This guy is an incredible figure. He fights in the Haitian Revolution on the side of the Spanish. The Spanish eventually take him, his entire family, all the people around, and evacuate them to Cuba and then to St. Augustine. This guy fights in every major struggle of the late 18th century. He's everywhere. And we have good documentation because later in life, he and his family go to the Spanish crown and say, oh, look at all I've done for you. You were there to pay me a pension. You know, so there's this long trail of documentation of his exploits, right, which is very unusual. Biassou. So Biassou is part of U.S. history, right? Because St. Augustine, after all, Jane Letters will love this, is the oldest European city in North America, right? So what you see then is these guys were circulating all over the Caribbean basin, sometimes fighting the American Revolution, sometimes in Haiti, sometimes, and they constantly are changing sides, right? So sometimes like, oh, the Spanish is a better deal, they're going to free us, they're going to give us land. Other times, no, I don't like what's happening here. For a lot of those guys who are under Spanish control, when the British come in and take control of Florida, bad news, they leave if they can. But basically what you're going to have is a struggle now between Dessalines and the other figures. Dessalines is assassinated, and eventually Christophe and Pétion, who will be the real survivor here, are dividing control of the island. So even though it's the independent Republic of Haiti initially, right, the northern part of the island is largely under the control of Christophe here, who then crowns himself Christophe I. Right? And the southern part of the island is under the control of Pétion. And when Christophe dies in 1820, Pétion becomes the dominant figure, and it's Pétion who will lead Haitian troops into the eastern part of the island and take control of Santo Domingo, right? And so what today is the Dominican Republic, until 1844, is under Haitian control, right? I'll mention this later when we talk about Spanish America. The Dominican Republic is an interesting place because it doesn't fit any pattern in these wars of independence. It goes back and forth. There's at one point in the 1860s when the Dominican Republic comes within one vote in the U.S. Senate of being annexed. One vote. Right? I always thought, well, what if that one vote had been in favor? So all those Dominican baseball players that are so great, you know, what, they'd be speaking English from birth? What? We'd have the state of Santo Domingo? I don't know. So the message here is this is not only chaotic and a bloodbath for a long period during the uprising, right? Multiple foreign interventions that are all eventually defeated, multiple civil wars among powerful leaders internally within the country. So this is why part of the legacy of Haiti in the 19th century is not a pretty picture, right? I mean, any time you fight a war for independence, it's bloody. It's problematic afterwards to how do you construct a stable social order, right? As we've seen in here before, George Washington, it's no small thing that George Washington steps aside, right, in 1799 and says, okay, I'm done. 1797, whatever. So he steps aside. So this figure who could have been king, he could have been president for life, right, says, no, I'm stepping aside. Someone else will take my place. Right, but then again, if you look at U.S. history in that first part of the 19th century, look how many generals are in there, right? Your war heroes become your presidents, right? So the pattern across all the Americas is those people who are the warriors who emerge, the caudillos, the men on horseback who emerge out of the wars for independence, quite logically dominate the early years of independence. The dilemma facing most of these places is how do you get away from militarism, factionalism, personalistic politics, and establish an order of transition, right? Here it is. The countries in the Americas that achieve, in Latin America that achieve this quickest and have the best experience in the 19th century are Brazil, Chile, and Costa Rica. By the 1840s, those three places have essentially worked out some sort of system of stability and participation of the elites in some sort of power sharing arrangement. Not anybody else, just the elites. Right. The other end of the extreme is Mexico. Mexico does not achieve this, anything close to this until the 20th century. Right. Mexico between 1821 and 1871, by the official count, has 50 presidents. Right. It is invaded by the United States twice, loses 2/3 of its territory, is invaded by the French and occupied civil wars until the 1870s under a dictator, Porfirio Diaz, who will rule for another 3.5 decades, that Mexico achieves some sort of internal political stability. They pay a very high price for that first half century of chaos. Right? So the sooner you can move away from the, in our case, Shays Rebellion and all this sort of stuff, the sooner you move away from that, right, the quicker you're going to have that stability. In Haiti, they're going to pay a high price because throughout the 19th century, it's literally a series of strongmen, caudillos, dictatorship, which means that the island cannot, even within the elite, there's not a power sharing arrangement. And what really is striking about Haiti is there is a color hierarchy in which the darker skinned people feel aggrieved because the lighter skinned people are condescending, rule over them. So there is a actually color clash which still exists within Haiti. Now if you're in the U.S. South, after 1791, you're going, look what's happening here. Where do those French planters go? A lot of them come to the U.S. and they go, let me tell you, you don't want to face this, right? So if you look at the U.S., especially things like legislation, state by state in the early 19th, the color and slave legislation gets more and more rigid. So this kind of somewhat fluidity that existed in, say, the 18th century of recognizing people of multiple colors, for example, gets more and more rigid. As a non-U.S. historian, one of the things that always struck me, in 1860, right on the eve of the Civil War, only 2% of all the blacks in the U.S. South were free. 2%. That basically meant to be black was synonymous with being slave in the U.S. South. Right? This is a completely different world from Haiti in the 18th century. We already have a free black population, free mulatto population. A place like Brazil, where when abolition takes place in the 1880s, there's an enormous free population of color. Right? The system is much more fluid. Right? Whereas what happens in the U.S., the system becomes increasingly more and more rigid. This will continue into the 20th century, right? There used to be a category for a racially mixed person, mulattoes, in the U.S. Census. And it's taken out at the beginning of the 20th century. So we become more and more rigid. It makes us a bipolar society, which is only breaking down now, right? I mean, this, somebody who studies Brazil always thinks this is goofy. There are only black people and white people. You know, I look at Halle Berry. Now, if one parent's white and one's black, why is she black? Right? That's us, right? The Brazilians go, she's not black. She's a mulatta, right? And so what you see is the U.S., the lesson in the U.S. is to become more and more repressive and to make it less and less possible to free people even if you want to, right? Slaves are more and more tightly bound in a more and more rigid system until 1861. In Cuba and Brazil, which emerged the other two huge slave populations in size in the Americas, Cuba really doesn't emerge as a big slave plantation society until the 18th century, and especially after the late 18th century. Our vision of Cuba, the sugar plantations, that's really the 19th century. It's because of Haiti, right? Those planters will go to Cuba, the capital will move there, money flows over in that direction, and Cuba really emerges as this big slave-holding sugar, tobacco society in the 19th century, in the aftermath of the Haitian Revolt. So that image of Cuba really is the 19th century image. And Cuba literally becomes the world's great sugar plantation. It replaces Saint-Domingue. There's this old phrase in Cuba, without sugar there is no country. which is almost still true. So Cuba will become the beneficiary of the Haitian uprising, right? It grows as this plantation. Brazil is on a completely different magnitude. The slave population of Brazil in 1800 is about 1.5 million to 2 million. Right? It's the largest slave society in the Americas. Brazil is the largest slave population in the Americas, with the exception of a period between about 1820 and 1860 when the U.S. population becomes. After the 60s, Brazil is once again the largest population. So at a place like Cuba and Brazil, as we'll see in the coming weeks, when all these guys like, oh, independence, war, they're going, maybe not. They're looking at Haiti, and they're going, maybe not. Okay? So this is going to powerfully shape the experience in Cuba, which is right next door, and will not have a war for independence until the middle of the 19th century. And in a place like Brazil, when the war for independence takes place, it's almost not a war. Right? There's minimal bloodshed. For those guys who are living in bondage, not just slaves, right? I mean, think of all those slaves. They hear about this. They become aware of this. It's not like this is a big secret. They're going, But there is no other slave rebellion anywhere like this in the aftermath. But for those people who see themselves in bondage, those Spanish Creole elites, right, who live under the oppressive monarchies of Spain or maybe Portugal, they're thinking, aha, it is possible. The U.S. has done this. Even the slaves in Haiti have risen up and succeeded in achieving independence. They have two living, breathing examples. And they're actually two interesting examples because they'll go, if we do this, not the path of Haiti, the path of the U.S. That's the path we want to pursue. So if we unleash revolution here, it has to be the kind in the U.S. and not what has happened in Haiti. All right? So, questions?
In Haiti, what replaced the loss of the trade, the sugar trade?
Nothing, basically. I mean, part of the problem, here's the long term. Part of the problem you see in Haiti today is a society which the land is divided up into small plots, which is cultivated in ways that are not, especially as the population increases, that are not very ecologically aware. So constant degradation of the landscape. So if you go to Haiti today, it would take decades to reestablish viable agriculture in Haiti. Right? And especially because of the size of the population. Essentially this is the dilemma of all revolutions in the 19th and early 20th century. Mexico is a good example of this. If you give every peasant his piece of land, that's not very productive. Right? This is why when Fidel takes power, he goes, no, we're not going to do that. We'll have collective farms and everybody will have a part of that because it's going to be more productive. So when you divide up the land and everybody takes their little piece and you grow your corns and your rice and your beans, your piece of tobacco, that's not a particularly productive way to do it. So it impoverishes the society as a whole. Right? There's only one place I can think of in the Americas where in the aftermath of independence there is a conscious decision to say the outside world is bad. We don't need railroads and telegraphs. We don't need all that sort of thing. We can provide ourselves with the own. It's Paraguay, which is a very unusual example. Until the 1860s, when the Brazilians and the Argentines invade and annihilate most of the adult male population, Paraguay literally turns inward and says we can feed ourselves with the kind of agricultural system we have. We don't need the rest of the world. In the case of Haiti, it's sort of forced isolation because all of these regimes are going to take a long, long time before they will even recognize the independence of Haiti. Eventually, when we do recognize the independence, Frederick Douglass at one point is the U.S. ambassador to Haiti. But it's always a problematic relationship because, especially before 1861, right? How do you recognize slaves who revolt and gain their independence when you hold so many slaves in your own society? But I think that what happens is you get this incredible, it's like the piece of property I live on. Here you go. I live out west of town on this is what happens when you sell a piece of property to a historian. So 27 years ago, I bought this house, and I went, oh, well, let me go research the deed. Right, so I started, it's like my introduction to archives in Nashville. You know, I'm working about who had it before. It turns out I'm sitting in the middle of what was a 700-acre revolutionary land grant to one of the Gower family, the original settlers in Nashville. I go, oh. But you know, you look at the history of this, it's like, then in the early 19th century, divided up into 6 pieces. Then in the late 19th century, each one of them divides his place up into 4 or 5 pieces. Well, you look at today, there's one piece of property which is not going to be built on because it's definitely floodplain. There's 55 acres. Everything else is maybe 4 or 5 acres, right? So you have parceling, right? You couldn't have productive agriculture now. So as it gets split up into more and more pieces with more and more people, you get this small-scale agriculture, and it's incredible. It might feed you internally for a while, but eventually you can't feed the population because you don't have modern agriculture.
After 1844, what happened to the East?
The Dominican Republic is a weird story. The Dominican Republic, after 1844, is liberated, right? So if you read their sort of textbooks about, you know, the guy who leads this revolt, that's the fathers of independence. But then they literally go shopping around over the next 25 years to just about everybody in sight saying, maybe we ought to join these guys. Maybe we ought to join these guys. They go back to the Spanish, and then they eventually come to the U.S., and Sam probably knows a lot more about this. But, you know, there's this incredibly corrupt deal-making that goes on, so that when this treaty, which is signed under the Grant administration, comes up for a vote, the big debate is not necessarily about the Dominican Republic, but who's behind this and who's going to make money off of it, right? And it's really only after that the Dominican Republic goes, okay, we'll stay independent. So this is why when you try and pick the date of Dominican independence, you have a variety of choices. Now, which one of these moments is it actually, right? Is it in the 1820s? Is it 1840s? Is it in the 1860s? So when I put together this course on it was the most difficult case to fit into any other patterns here. Because I have the sort of, here are the ones that sort of have a logic and are part of this process. Here are the ones where there is no real war for independence at that moment. And then here's the Dominican Republic, keeps going back and forth. It is weird when you see them sort of shopping around.
Is the fact that the prevailing winds are from the southeast and there are mountains in the center of the island, does that cause the rain to be less on the western end and put the people in Haiti as a disadvantage for agriculture?
I don't know. You guys hear that? Prevailing winds come out of the southeast, and this creates an imbalance in agriculture in the island. So that the western end is actually an unfair. I don't know, but I'd say, you know, I'm not an agronomist, I guess. So, you know, you're always going to have disadvantages, and so you figure out what to do with the landscape you've got to feed yourself. So there are a lot of places that don't have particularly favorable environments where people, Israel being a prime example, right, of how to make the desert bloom, how to plant things. And I'd say Haiti never even attempts this. So even if you start, so it sort of multiplies. If you start with an unfavorable environment and then you don't exploit it well, that multiplies your problems. But let's face it, here, I'll give my speech.
Don't they have a monsoon season?
Hurricanes. Yeah, I'd say this, but this is a problem all over the, this is a larger problem with the Caribbean and what I would call small places, especially today. Some places are not viable economic units. Right? Let's face it, Grenada, St. Kitts, take your pick. Those are not viable economic units, and their future hinges on being part of something bigger. And let's face it, we're all debating, okay, should we have an American, all the Americas in a trade unit? What are we going to do about the Chinese? What are we going to do about the EU? You know, if you're Costa Rica, you can do pretty well, but ultimately your market's 4 million people. Right? So even if you can feed yourselves and do relatively well, eventually you need to be part of something bigger. So I think, you know, even if Haiti had been best case scenario, right? They exploited the land well, they do a really good job, eventually you have to be connected somehow to something larger, a larger unit to be a viable economy. And I think we see it easily today, but maybe it wasn't as true in, say, 1900. But that's why I just think small places are at an enormous disadvantage. Over here.
I had heard that pre-Civil War New Orleans was different than all other southern cities, and there was also more like the French Spanish. You had a more overt color hierarchy, whereas you said in the other South, when you're black or white, there's no gradation.
Yeah, New Orleans is a completely different place, and it's because it changes hands. I mean, part of it is this interesting location, but it's French, then Spanish, then it's part of the U.S., which is bad news for those people of color once it becomes part of the U.S., right? Because the system is less flexible. So what you do see in New Orleans is this very large, much more diverse, every sense of the term, population. At one point, when I was trying to find comparisons for Brazil, I was astonished when I read it. None of these numbers are exact, but this is what I remember. Rio de Janeiro in 1820 has a population of nearly 100,000. 35 to 40,000 of those people are slaves. That is the largest urban slave population in the Americas. Right? A third to 40% of all the population of the city are people living in slavery. Right? And I said, well, what's it like in the United States? New Orleans and Charleston have the largest slave populations, and I believe New Orleans was at 20,000. Somewhere like 15 to 20,000. So I mean, if you were living in a place like New Orleans versus Boston, that's a very different experience. This is why the first time I went to New Orleans, I'm walking through the French Quarter and went, wow, this is the only place I've ever been in the United States. It sort of feels like Brazil. And it is, you've got this French, multiple changes, influences from the Caribbean basin. Makes that a very different place from Baltimore.
What is your prognosis for Haiti?
God. Not good. I've said this for a long time. Haiti is not a nation. Right? You can't be a nation unless you have a central state that functions. There is no functioning central state in Haiti. So what you have in Haiti is this conglomeration of, here it is, here's to be real academic, because like Max Weber, right? The state is a legitimate monopoly on violence, right? That's what keeps you together, right? Somebody has a legitimate monopoly on violence. Only the state can exert violence, right? And everybody else, no. This doesn't exist in Haiti. You have multiple people who engage in violence, and there's not a central authority to control that. And I don't have particularly rosy predictions, because look at Haiti, and here's a Brazilian connection. The UN peacekeeping force that's been in Haiti for a long time now is run by a Brazilian general. The major contingent of troops are from Brazil. When the earthquake took place, I was in Brazil, and there was this incredibly goofy process where the Brazilians said, no, we can handle this, we can handle this. And the U.S. are sending in troops, going, no, we'll take care of it. And you literally had like the U.S. troops over here on one side of the plaza and the Brazilians on the other side handing out food. Like they're competing with each other, right? But there is no central authority. There is no recognized central authority. And until you have that, you can't have a viable nation in any sense of the term. You got to establish some kind of public security. I mean, it doesn't have to be no violence at all, but you got to have some kind of public security. And the earthquake is like the last straw on this, right? The place was incredibly poor, incredibly chaotic, and then the earthquake hits. And this is where you also see the difference. This is kind of like the agriculture. The difference, within months, there's an earthquake of similar magnitude in Chile. It killed, in Haiti, you're talking about a couple 100,000 people at least, right? In Chile, maybe a couple of thousand. I mean, similar magnitude, equally as, why? Because the Chileans have literally built a society that's more sustainable. The architecture is more adapted to earthquakes. In Haiti, everything's sort of makeshift, right? So if you started tomorrow and said, I mean, the Haitians just held another election, right? And you look at this and go, oh my God. If tomorrow the guy who's elected president turns the country around, it'll take decades, just to reestablish some sort of central authority and some sort of viable economy. Right? Before the 1980s, Duvalier, Papa Doc ran things. It's kind of like the good news, bad news of dictators. It's like, you didn't have to worry about crime on the streets. everybody was safe, right? But the hard hand of repression, right? And Haiti was basically this sort of small-scale, what are on the U.S. border called maquiladoras, assembly third place. Every baseball that we used was made in Haiti, hand-sewn, right? Textile firms and small businesses, it was this sort of incredibly cheap labor, send your stuff down. So that was the nature of the economy. Since the mid-1980s, the country has been in chaos, and so who's going to invest money there? Who's going to build anything? They were living off massive, foreign aid before the earthquake. And it's also within Haiti itself. You see this. Aristide came back. Baby Doc has come back. They have this. I mean, unless you can get some sort of elite consensus on how to run things, that's not going to happen. So I'm very pessimistic about it. I don't think it's a viable nation at this point. It's hard to say that about almost anywhere in the world. I have no solutions for that. Is that depressing?
Well, I wanted to say two things going back a minute to the slavery. In Franklin, the Black Graveyard in Franklin,
yes.
Tennessee, is Toussaint Louverture graveyard. It's been restored.
Oh.
So American blacks do understand.
Yeah, did you guys know this? This is something I stumbled across. I'm driving down, I'm going to Franklin one day, and I get to Del Rio Pike, and I went, what's that historical marker over there? Toussaint Louverture Cemetery. Wait, what? It's like I nearly ran over somebody. And I pulled, there's a huge cemetery there, but the chunk that's right there on the corner obviously has been historically a black cemetery for a long, long time in Franklin. So I get out, I'm going around, what are the names of the gravestones? I'm looking for people, right? So there is a marker there. I went online, tried to look for it. I could find no. Walter Durham, who's like local historian, it's like I go to Walter and say, do you know anything about, nah, you ought to ask this guy. No, he didn't, couldn't find anybody locally who knows anything about it, but there's a historical mark up there, and it's the Toussaint Louverture Cemetery.
Well, now it's taken care of and everything, but the connection is that American blacks did understand Toussaintville, and they did understand insurrection.
Well, this is one of the things, people who study slavery now have really sort of dug down to a level of analysis now where they're showing, some guy gets off a ship from Philadelphia in, somewhere in the Bahamas, he's carrying newspapers with him, in correspondence. Then he goes to Havana. There's this circulation that's going all over the Atlantic world of people with correspondence and broadsides and newspapers, so that in the old days, these guys are all so distant and separated. It's like, no. They all are circulating a world in which they're constantly getting information about what's going on in other places. So, which is why these planners are so, it's like the Chinese now with the internet, right? You don't want everybody reading this stuff, right? So how do you block it? Search people coming off ships, try and arrest people, but you can't stop that information flow.
Secondly, weren't a lot of the whites because it was massacring from Haiti and all came to New York?
They go all over the place. There's this diaspora of, yeah. Oh yeah, but it actually begins before then. Yeah, so this is, at one point about 4 or 5 years ago, suddenly people started asking me to come to conferences about the U.S. South and the world. It's like, I go, no, I'm the one that actually studies Southern history, right? Really Southern history, right? And so it's very interesting, all these guys in trying to recreate themselves, right? Because the old form of U.S. Southern Studies is like passé, right? We recreate so suddenly you start getting these, like at LSU, the Center for Louisiana and Caribbean Studies. Oh, clever. So what you actually see now is lots of people, all my friends who do borderlands history. Now it's like the old borderlands were sort of, the sort of southern tier of the United States. Now it's like, where are the borderlands in? Are we going to do the islands of the Caribbean? Is it like northern coast of South America? But you see this sort of connecting up places like New Orleans and Mobile and St. Augustine and place them in context outside of the traditional boundaries of the U.S. and look at the Caribbean basin. And what you see is it's an incredibly cosmopolitan world. These guys are literally circulating Africa, Brazil, the islands of the Caribbean, to New England, to England and France, and they're carrying with them information all the time. This is why when you look at the American Revolution, it's pretty amazing. This came up last time about Germans, but there are all kinds of people coming in, getting involved in the revolution, right? Spanish soldiers and, you know, French intellectuals and former slaves, all are involved in this. So it's, you really do have to, this gets back to my sort of central point. This really is a process taking place all over the Atlantic world. And so when the American Revolution takes place, we like to think of it as the American Revolution, but it's part of this bigger process. And here, I'll leave you on this. When I started writing my history of Latin America, just the sort of professional confession here, the real question is, what's in Latin America and what's not, right? Because Latin America is, everybody agrees, we don't like the term, but we're stuck with it. Because, right, if it's just Latin, right, what about all those Indians and slaves, right? The vast majority of the people that live in Latin America until the 20th century are not of European descent, right? They're certainly not Latin in any sense of the term. So you say, okay, well, who's in, who's out? So I said, let me go back and look at all the other people who've written histories of Latin America and check, who did they include? And I go, oh, I never realized they're all real vague. But some of them have statistical tables in the back. Oh, who did they put in the tables? And it goes from my former advisor at UCLA, who had like everybody in the Caribbean was listed, but they were never mentioned in the text, right? To the people who are the real hardliners, it's only independent nations, right? Here's the nickel and dime definition. Those countries which emerged as independent nations in the 19th century out of Spain, and in one case Portugal, and sometimes France. Right? So you get these 18 Spanish-speaking countries. They're nations, right? So Puerto Rico's out, right? It's not independent. And they'll and then the question becomes, what do you do with Haiti? Right? Is it part of Latin America? And if you look at the textbooks, I taught this Colonial Latin American textbook for years. It's very good to survey of Colonial Latin America. And I went back through and I went, you know, I never noticed this, but Haiti's mentioned twice in passing. And I'm thinking, how could you talk about the wars for independence in Latin America and not mention Haiti? Right, and so it's sort of, but a lot of people they'll say, and then there's another very good new colonial history. The guy's got 2 full chapters on the Haitian Revolution. So this is the kind of range that people are not exactly sure, is it part of Latin America, is it not, where do we put it in? Because it is not only an unusual case because it's French, right, and gains its independence, but because it is this slave republic, and then afterwards, it clearly has a very different trajectory, partly because it's so insulated than what you see for the rest, even Cuba or Dominican Republic, right? So Haiti's an odd sort of case, and when you look around Latin America, people are not exactly sure whether it's part of it or not. I'm not even sure if Brazil's part of it. All right, so next week we'll move over to those guys in Spanish America, all right?